So, good afternoon, everyone. This is episode 7 of the That DV Show podcast, and I'm here with Jace. Hi, Jace. How you doing?
Well, thanks, mate. Good to be here. Very excited to be speaking with Julie and a very interesting topic today.
We have got a humdinger of a podcast for you guys. We have got the federal government's eSafety commissioner with us, Julie Inman-Grant, and we'll be talking to her in a moment. This episode is called eSafety, Who is Taking Care of Us? Which is an interesting topic. And what we're looking at really is the role of eSafety in helping to protect us in our daily lives online from all those bad actors out there and the people who are trying to infiltrate our minds via the internet. So, Jace, it's a big one, and we've got a lot to cover. Anything in particular that you're looking forward to talking to Julie about?
Yes, it is going to be a very interesting conversation. We've got some pretty big questions that I'm not really sure that we're actually going to get all the answers to be honest. But it's going to be fascinating to rack your brains, Julie, about the future of the internet, how we plan to have a bit of, what the governing structures of that might look like and what that means for us as individuals and users or consumers of the internet, and how that's going to change our relationship with data and probably even the government.
Indeed.
Yeah. So
a lot to cover.
There is.
So let me just tee this up, because I think that we're going to be covering quite a wide range of topics within the area of eSafety. And I want to just kind of position where Australia is in this particular domain, because this is something that we're leading the rest of the world in the way that we're tackling things like cyberbullying and protecting our citizens online. The Government Online Safety Act was passed into law in June this year, which is a major milestone. And it's a world first, because it's empowers the government's eSafety commissioner to force the removal of cyber abuse and exact fines on the people who are perpetrating those things if they're not complying with the act. This is really just the beginning, and I know that Julie's going to talk about this in some depth. But the technology landscape is changing so fast now, and there are so many new ways in which people can be abused online. It's going to be a gargantuan task for the eSafety Commission to keep up with this. But I do think that, Jason, we've got to give Julie an opportunity to introduce herself in a minute. But I just want to sort of describe for you what Julie's career's been like, because she's had the most extraordinary career, and she's got some really amazing credentials for what she's doing. So, her career covers working with Microsoft and working with Twitter, forming the policies and programs those organizations have adopted around safety and privacy and philanthropy. And now, of course, Julie, your role as eSafety Commissioner has led you to be described by the Australian press as one of the nation's most influential women. And for us here at Digital Village, the moniker that really stood out, and the one that we want to talk to you about towards the end here, is the title they gave you at the World Economic Forum in 2020 as being #Agile50, one of the world's most influential leaders revolutionising government. So you've got to tell us a bit more about that. And all this before we acknowledge the fact that you're a working mum, and besides having to supervise homeschooling for 3 children, you also lead the eSafety Office's ever-growing team, which I think is now up around about 120 people. Is that right?
We're actually approaching 200 now.
Oh my goodness
with a start
me.
of about 35. Yep, it's big.
Good.
It's a big, bad online world out there.
It is. So welcome, Julie. It's lovely to have you with us.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. And thanks, Paul and Jace, for the opportunity to be with you and to share some of these insights. I just want to note that I'm joining you today from Gadigal country here in Sydney, and I want to pay my respects to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and elders past, present, and emerging. But yet you gave a great and a very flattering introduction. And really, the Online Safety Act reforms that we saw are a continuation on the journey that we started back in 2015 when the Children's eSafety Commissioner was set up. And I'm sort of happy to tell you that the story about how that went about, because interesting cross-section of experiences. But yes, as you note, I am a working mom with 3 kids, and the juggle of the new normal of COVID is very much a live issue here. And in fact, I actually have a sister-in-law and niece and a second dog living with us now. So we've got a bustling house of
Wow.
7 people and two puppies. So there you go.
Oh,
You're
goodness
wondering
me.
why I look like I've just pulled my hair out.
You have got a lot on your plate, that's for sure. So look, where should we start, Julie? I mean, I know that there are several topics that you want to cover with us today. The one that really stood out for Jason and me was this whole one around the decentralization of the internet. I mean, obviously, as you know, Digital Village, which is the company we both work in, we're dealing with people who are trying to innovate and expand the internet every day. The decentralization subject is coming up again and again. Lots and lots again to cover there. But from your perspective, I mean, what do you see as being the potential in a decentralized internet world?
Well, listen, this actually brings a lot of deja vu back for me because, as you noted, I started working at the intersection of online safety, social justice, and technology policy more than 30 years ago. I worked for my hometown congressman, my first job out of uni. I had big ideals and even bigger hair. But and he came to me one day. I was working on a range of social issues, and he said, "Hey, we've got this small little software company called Microsoft in our district. Can you also work on telecom and technology issues as well?" So that started before the internet. I was hired by Microsoft to be one of their first lobbyists or government affairs people in Washington, D.C. in 1995, right before the antitrust case. But one of the first big pieces of legislation I worked on was the Communications Decency Act of 1996. So there's a lot of talk about Section 230 of that act because it's essentially given the platforms what we call intermediary immunity. They really haven't been responsible for the user-generated content or what's being hosted on their platforms. And I think you'll see that the Congress is giving this a rethink. But at that time, thinking about how we were trying to shape the internet for the future, the internet was just on the cusp. I was with Microsoft, but it was AOL, Yahoo, Alta Vista, Netscape, players that aren't even around anymore. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg was probably a teenager at the time, and Facebook was not even a glimmer in his eye. So we weren't thinking about social media and user-generated content in the same way, and we didn't want it to be overtaxed or overregulated. So there was this utopian view, and I was part of that group that just saw the future of an unfettered internet. But look at where we are today. And so when we do see very idealistic views around decentralization, or the D-Web as it's sometimes referred to, others refer to it as Web 3.0. And Tim Berners-Lee is one of the people who's certainly been a strong proponent of Web 3.0, arguing that the current internet architecture and design has become utterly dominated by monopolies and oligarchs at the expense of user autonomy and true digital freedom. So to a certain degree, that's right. But if you actually you fulfill that view and you've got blockchain and decentralized services and distributed computing, who then is responsible when things go wrong on the internet? And who's going to be accountable? So part of what the Online Safety Act is doing for us, and what other governments are starting to turn their minds to, is how do we make those companies more responsible? At least there's a regulatory target, a place where we can issue a notice to have that content taken down. But people talk about the internet being the Wild West now. What if there is no ownership, transparency, or accountability? So that's why we're saying, hey, we really have to think about this utopian view for the future and make sure that it doesn't become a dystopian reality because we're concerned about the big players. We need to think about the internet governance and build safety, privacy, privacy and security by design into the platforms.
Can we backtrack just one question? Is that all right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Really, with those kind of original utopian, I guess, intentions of the internet as it started and what you're involved in, what changed? How did it become what as we know it today?
Well, I mean, I love my road and automobile analogies, but you think about, I think it was about 55 years ago when Ralph Nader wrote Unsafe at Any Speed about the Chevrolet Corvair. Do you remember when we used to ride in the front seats of the family station wagon, and there were bench seats and there were no seat belts? So it was about that time they found that seat belts, lo and behold, actually save lives. And the car manufacturers railed against that. They didn't want to have to embed seatbelts. But 50 years later, when we get into our cars, we
Yes.
almost take for granted that the seatbelts are embedded, that there are airbags and anti-lock brakes. And car manufacturers actually compete on safety factors, and it's all guided by international standards. So we're at this tipping point with the industry where they've been totally unregulated. Or mostly unregulated for the better part of 30 years. And because nobody's really wanted to put a brake on the kind of innovation and economic growth that technology has brought. But that sort of meant that, we're relying on their goodwill to a certain degree to be doing the right thing. Now, 20 years ago when I was at Microsoft, do you remember when Windows was considered a really unsafe and unsecure platform and just riddled with vulnerabilities?
Yes.
Well, I knew we were going to be very serious when Bill Gates in 2001 said, hey, we're taking every single engineer and technical person off anything they're working on. We're going to totally recode hundreds of millions of lines of Windows codes, and we're going to code out those vulnerabilities. And then we're going to set up a trustworthy computing division that's focused on privacy, safety, accessibility, security. The challenge that I've seen throughout my career is that security has always had that primacy, and it is fundamental. We're talking about the infrastructure, the technology, the policies, and the processes. Fundamentally, we need to be secure, but closely followed by privacy. And I think that was boosted up with the European data privacy regulation and the compliance that had to happen there. But safety has always been an afterthought. And so I took the whole idea of safety by design. I was, spent 17 years at Microsoft, and my last 3 years were in trustworthy computing. There are about 400 people working on security, probably about 50 working on privacy, and there were about 8 of us working on safety. So I remember taking the whole idea of safety by design to the leadership, because we were doing product reviews and reviewing it for safety and for security and privacy, but not the personal harms that were caused by our interactive services. And I kind of got the fob off like, we're becoming an enterprise company. And I pointed out, well, look at Skype. It's the primary vector for live stream child sexual abuse material. Look at Xbox Live. Nobody can disagree with the fact, particularly in the wake of Gamergate, that online gaming isn't toxic. So leadership is important. And when you think about the companies that we have there today, larger collectively than many developing nations in terms of GDP, they have vast financial resources, access to the top intellectual capability, advanced technology tools. I believe that if leaders set their mind to it and wanted to make their platforms safer and less toxic, it would have been done by now. So this is why we have to push. And we have.
Julie, what's holding
tools.
them back? Why is that though? Because I think that it makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't an organization want to put safety at the front of whatever it is they're doing? Because that's such a powerful message for the consumer to know I'm being looked after, I'm being protected, I can feel safe here. Why is the safety message not put at the front of all of the messaging that these large tech companies put out?
Well, again, now you know why you see me as a poacher turned gamekeeper, because I spent 22 years within the industry trying to be an antagonist, inside, saying, hey, these are your customers, these are your consumers, and they're actually being they're experiencing personal harms as a result of this. Often safety was considered a cost center. They're looking at shareholder value, and I think basically the simple fact of the matter is, if your primary goal is creating stickiness on your platform, and of course it is, a lot of that engagement is driven by conflict. It's driven by young people, as we saw with the Facebook files. A young person who may have underlying mental health issues or body image issues may be looking for affinity groups on the platform, or even be tracked outside the platform, and then they get stuck in this endless spiral of algorithmic whirlpool, where they look for something around a diet, and then they start getting pro-ana and pro-bulimia content delivered to them. And I think it's going to take governments stepping in around the world and saying enough is enough. So we've got a head start. We spend a lot of time talking to other governments about what we've learned over the past 6 years, and I expect in the next 5 years we'll have a network of online harms and online safety regulators, just as we do data protection authorities.
So just returning to the decentralization discussion again, obviously the emergence of things like blockchain, distributed applications, more peer-to-peer products appearing on the market now. Do you feel that those are the things that are actually going to drive engagement around a decentralized internet?
I think they'll be the foundation stones for a decentralized internet, and I actually think that those technologies have some really viable usage. Right now, we're looking at developing an age verification roadmap for the government. That looks at technologies, policies and regulatory settings. And blockchain could have a really important role in terms of helping to verify children in a way that distributes the personal information that's being captured about them, so that they can't be re-identified. So there are lots of great roles for this, but we need to make sure that we're building in the protections up front. And that's really the same thing that we as eSafety have been saying about end-to-end encryption. We're realistic and understanding that really what's driving companies now is we're seeing young people and others leaving traditional social media, that open social media, and they're moving more to private messaging services. And each of these companies want to be the most private and most secure, and provide those messaging services. But what happens when they turn out the light and go dark? They can't see what's happening on their services anymore. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the early adopters of the D-Web technologies now are the pedophile networks, are the pro-terrorist groups, those that need to organize and communicate behind closed doors, so to speak. So we need to find a way to find that balance. And I think that is the biggest question for the technology industry for the coming decade. How do you achieve that great balancing act of privacy, safety, and security? We just saw that play out with the whole the Apple neural hash move, and I can talk more about that. But long story short, the technology was actually developed by one of their preeminent privacy engineers, and of course, Apple has great privacy bona fides, but if you compare them to Facebook, last year Facebook reported almost 20 million instances of child sexual abuse material to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. That's required by law in the US. By comparison, Apple submitted 265 versus 20 million. So they've got over 1 billion handsets out there, billions of people on iCloud. You can't tell me, out of all those billions of images, probably trillions of images out there, that there isn't more than 265 instances of a known child sexual abuse material. But they put that out there, and I commend them for taking that effort. think, taking that responsibility and trying to think about doing it in a protective way. But we saw just so much polarization and so much pressure from civil libertarians and privacy in the security community. It's starting to feel like there isn't any middle ground on anything anymore. And we're certainly seeing that with all the online abuse that's happening. There's just polarization everywhere. And I suppose that's what happens when the whole world converges on the internet, and there's fear, uncertainty, and doubt everywhere.
That's the message we were getting from Alistair McGibbon a couple of weeks back when we were interviewing him, was that there is this polarization that's taking place where, some organizations are adopting a very, very transparent approach. If they get hacked or they're under a ransomware attack, they tell people. And by telling people and sharing that, at least they are providing people with the information up front, and they're giving the opportunity for others to avoid being trapped into ransomware attacks and cyber attacks. And then at the other end of the scale, you've got people who are just, basically not sharing that information, are dealing with the ransomware attackers, paying the ransoms, and basically just proliferating the whole process.
It's enabling the process, isn't it?
It's enabling it. It is. It is. And you see the same thing in the safety domain as well. That we've got that kind
100%.
of, yeah.
100%. Just think about the Facebook files controversy.
Yes.
That's all about transparency, really, because it's not uncommon that companies will do foundational research to understand, how their user journeys and how the users are using the technology, how it might be benefiting them, how it might be hurting them. That in and of itself is actually a good thing. It's what you do with that information that makes the difference. And because it was perceived to have been swept under the rug rather than used as a course of action, well, this is what's happening to young teens who are using our website. Maybe we should think about building in the protections rather than sweeping it under the carpet. That's what I think people are really quite angry about. It's this selective transparency we've been seeing from the industry for way too long, when we need to see much more radical transparency. And that's what some of our new powers will give us the ability to do, is to, if that opacity continues to be the modus operandi, we will have some tools around our basic online safety expectations to be able to compel transparency reports from a broad range of platforms across 8 different subsectors of industry to tell us what's actually happening under the hood.
Yeah. No, sorry, Jason, did you want to say something?
I guess I was just wanting to have a bit of a chat about how quickly we see this moving in terms of organizations adopting a kind of safety first mindset in their product development. It seems like there is more awareness than ever, and it's increasing quite dramatically, especially around data and privacy, and more people being online, and even to the point of bullying and things like that we'll probably chat about shortly. But I guess it seems like there's an opportunity for organizations to actually be taking, following a purely customer-centric approach of like serving a specific need of their users, of having safety built in. I guess that's kind of easier for a new business to adopt. How might a established organization carry out that redevelopment of the product?
That's a great question, and that's one that we've been actioning for the past, actually almost 3.5 or 4 years. So I think I mentioned to you, I took the whole concept of safety by design to Microsoft 10 years ago. I tried to inculcate some of that in my time at Twitter and Adobe. They were just different kind of organizations with different levels of capability. So one of the first things we started in 2018 was an initiative called Safety by Design, where we sat down with the industry to develop a principles-based framework. And because I knew that this is a cultural change program more than anything else, we have to move from that ethos of moving fast and breaking things and profits at all costs to one that still encourages innovation to flourish, but also allows them to assess the risks and then build in the protections, bake them in rather than bolt them on, if you will. So we sat down with the industry, and the three major pillars of safety by design are service provider responsibility. How do we encourage user empowerment and autonomy? And then how do we achieve that level of transparency and accountability? So we had a lot of the big players sign on, including Snap, Google, others. And we're Yubo, which is a dating site that's based out of France. Snap is doing some incredible stuff and really looking to incorporate that. But we decided that just having a set of principles wasn't enough. What we really need to do is raise the standards. So we spent another 18 months developing some interactive assessment tools for industry. So we have one for the startup world, and we've got one for mid-tier and enterprise customers. And so obviously with the startups, they're thinking about very different things. They're not going to have a trust and safety team. They're not going to have probably a general counsel. They're going to be thinking about, how do I get customers, get my technology out there and start developing some revenue? So it's much more light touch, and it's educative. It would take them about an hour to go through the assessment tools, and it will spit out a report and say, well, if your platform does this and facilitates this kind of interaction, you need to think about A, B, and C. And this is how Snap has done it. And this is how, so we try and surface up best practice. That's been taken up in about 30 countries. When I started talking about safety by design 3 years ago, I felt like I was yelling into, an empty canyon. We just saw earlier this year, the G7 put together a set of internet safety principles in Cornwall, and safety by design was part of that. It's really starting to take off. I was just at another global conference where someone from Pinterest, and we'd never engaged them, was talking about safety by design. And then there's a whole safety tech industry that's kind of developing on top of this. Which I think is great, but at the same time, I do wonder, going back to if you think about the antivirus and the anti-malware world 15 years ago, there were tons of vendors. There were the Nortons and the Semantics, and then we started to see some consolidation. And then what started happening is the operating systems and the big vendors started building in native controls or embedding them into their operating system, and kind of disintermediated that industry. You might end up starting to see that with safety as well. I mean, we now have seen Apple embed their native parental controls, their screen time controls into their phones. Hopefully we'll see. What we're really seeing in the safety space is we're seeing a lot of protections and features issued by press release. And every time that this comes out, I'll say to them, okay, that's great. You're thinking about a problem, you're trying to address it, but can you tell me in 3 months, what is the take up, what is the efficacy, and what is the impact? And we never seem to get that data, and that's why this transparency point is so important. I think these companies, particularly those struggling with the reputational problems right now, if they actually fix the fundamentals and fix the problems with their platforms, the better reputation will come over time. But this is where actions do need to speak louder than words.
Yeah, and it's, there is a big part of it is a culture thing and a set of principles that kind of guides behavior, but it so much comes down to the people within the organization and how they're making decisions about things. And it's, and especially as we get into a world that, if it does, become more decentralized, relying on people making good decisions and actually having a kind of mentality of, well, how do I behave when nobody's watching? And I guess we're kind of stuck in hoping that people make the right decisions, and around, I guess it's kind of ethics. And so what do we do about bad actors then, and what level of insight or control do we have over that?
That's precisely why we're talking about decentralization right now. Now is the time we should be thinking about how we build in those protections, how we build in proper governance structures. Let's foresee the future, and build these in directly. So for all the innovation that the companies have brought, I think the drivers, have been challenging. So, the feedback and the pushback, and really the techlash that's happening now, is really a response to lack of mindful consideration or prioritization of safety from my perspective. And I don't think tech wreck moments are inevitable. I often talk about Zoom as a perfect example. Gosh, they scaled incredibly. I think they had 10 million daily active users in December 2019. By March of the following year, once the lockdown started around the world, they scaled to 200 million.
200, that's right.
By March. By April, the Zoom bombing had started happening, and some real questions came out about their security and privacy settings as well. And it was interesting to see the CEO come out and said, "But before all this happened, I never thought about online harassment before." And you kind of want to scratch your head and go, how can you build an interactive video platform where you're actually putting people together and not think that there's going to be conflict or things are going to go wrong? But I think that's the key point. That's not the way that a typical founder thinks. So one of the other things that we've done is we've reached out to the investor and the VC community. And we've put together some due diligence clauses for them, as well as, we don't think this should be a checklist exercise, but we want to be realistic about what startups can do. But use them as a lever to make sure that the companies that they're funding are doing the right thing and aren't going to end up harming people. So we're also working with 4 different universities to incorporate safety by design curricula across, computer science, engineering, business ethics classes. Let's create that next generation of engineers and computer scientists that are coding with conscience and are thinking mindfully about what they're building and how it can be misused. Because you can engineer out this misuse as long as you look forward and you think about how your platforms might be weaponized.
Yes, and just going back to that point around the investment community, I mean, there is a precedent for this, because if you look at what's happening in the climate change and sustainability area, the investment community is really driving these large corporates to have a policy to demonstrate that they're actually doing good, to demonstrate that they're participating in things like the circular economy. And if they're not doing that, they're not going to invest in those companies.
That's right. And you have even the UN as an ESG program that's guiding a lot of ethical investing. And to us, we see this as a key to ethical investing in technology. It's a complex ecosystem. And what's been really interesting that we've seen lately is it's been the Australian banks that have really embraced safety by design in the context of, Westpac had that, terrible situation where they were fined by Austrac for enabling the payments of live stream child sexual abuse material and trafficking in children. And so they put a focus on this. But then about 18 months ago, we have a program called eSafety Women that deals with technology facilitated abuse that is an extension of almost all cases of family and domestic violence. And we were hearing from the domestic violence sector that former partners were making child support payments online and using that as a vector to issue microaggressions and abuse their former partners. And sometimes they'd send 50 over the course of 2 hours with what we call micro transactions or microaggressions. So first it was CBA and then Westpac, and we've talked to NAB and a couple of others, and ANZ Bank. Banks are becoming more like technology platforms. And so safety by design makes sense for them as well. So I think it will have a range of applications, and it's really good to see the Australian banking and financial sector leaning in here.
Couldn't agree more. Look, I think it's obvious that the eSafety Commission is having an impact as well. I wanted to kind of look at the stats that have been provided as well around the number of illegal and harmful online content instances that you're having to deal with. So I can see why you've had to grow your team so dramatically in the last few years, Julie. I mean, 10,900 reported incidents in 2019, 20,796 in 2020, a 90% increase in 12 months.
Yeah, and we've had the online content scheme in place for 20 years. Before eSafety was created, it sat within other departments or other agencies. But it was ended up being about 21,000 reports last year. We're seeing no signs of it abating, and it does make sense. You've got, like I said, the whole world congregating online, including children. Our investigators were seeing early in 2020 that pedophiles were sharing user manuals on how to groom children, and to encourage contact defending, how to evade police, in this current environment. And then we saw at one point with the image-based abuse, or the non-consensual sharing of intimate images and videos, around the Easter long weekend in 2020, we saw a 600% increase. And part of that was owing to a range of sexual extortion scams that were going around, which were fairly sophisticated. So they used some of the data from Have I Been Pwned? You can put your email in and see if it's been
hacked, yeah,
hacked,
compromised, yeah.
Compromised, and with what passwords. So they were sending passwords to these emails saying, we have your password, we've hacked in, we've seen all the Rudy nudies, we've got them. If you don't pay us, we're going to share them on the internet, and we know who your friends are, and this sort of thing. So this is the sad thing about, we see this with natural disasters. We saw this with the bushfires. We're seeing this with COVID. Scammers are social engineers. They'll play upon humans' best instincts.
Yep.
GoFundMe pages, fake GoFundMe pages around, funerals, collecting funeral expenses. But they'll also play upon our worst fears, and they try and make people panic in order to pay. And of course, we know once you pay, then you end up in this endless cycle of them going back and forth. So we took a lot of those reports. People were obviously using digital intimacy tools more frequently over the lockdown, and then when things went wrong, I guess you could say it's a form of relationship retribution, where these things are posted online.
So what happens when people actually raise one of these reports with you, and you carry out an investigation? What sort of powers have you got to actually remedy any of these reported abuses?
Well, they're relatively significant powers, and we'll have a new set of a new scheme and a new set of strengthened powers with the new act that will come into force in January 2022. But just to give you an example around image-based abuse, I think we've received close to 6,000 reports since the scheme started in 2018. Often people come to us because they just want the images taken down. So they collect the evidence, they send us the URLs, we investigate. Sometimes we'll get reports with up to 400 URLs, and we'll have to go to each of those websites. But despite all that, we have a 90% success rate in terms of getting these images and videos taken down from thousands of overseas sites. Because we have such a robust online content scheme, and it's been in place for about 20 years, very, very little illegal content is hosted here. So it's almost all overseas. So we also have what we call a range of remedial actions that we can use some civil powers. So we can issue a formal or an informal notice. We can have, force a perpetrator to apologize, delete the content from their phone. We can fine them up to $111,000. We can fine content hosts up to $500,000. So a wide range of powers. And then with adult cyber abuse, this will be the first time anywhere in the world a government really has attempted to, and it's at a very high threshold for that reason, because we want to balance freedom of expression and opinion and objectionable content and name calling with serious adult cyber abuse with intent to harm. But
Sure.
trolls won't be able to do that with total impunity anymore, and there will be significant penalties there.
Right.
Yeah, I don't really have any follow-on questions. I guess I just get stuck with, people having I don't know, the intentions of people. I guess I kind of have utopian views around the way people should behave, but I just don't know how, we can have a level of control over these people. I mean, these kinds of people are always going to be out there. It's the kind of strange world we live in. So I don't really know if I have any specific questions around what we could possibly do to improve that situation. But
yeah, I mean, I think it's part of what we try and do around the prevention, awareness, and research work that we do is to look at the prevalence, but to also talk about the harms and the impact that this kind of abuse has on people. And so not only were we trying to strengthen their digital resilience and hone their critical reasoning skills, but we talk a lot about with school kids and educators about the 4 R's of the digital age: respect, responsibility, resilience, and critical reasoning skills. We've got to start young. We've got to start inculcating these behaviors and this knowledge, and frankly, just these safeguarding behaviors in children. 42% of Australian kids are given access to a digital device by the time they're 2. By the time they're 4 years old, it's up at, it's 94%. And of course, usually it's an iPhone or an iPad with a movie on it, but these aren't the passive entertainment devices that the TV was, that our mom used to put us in front of. They're connected to the internet. And if you don't have parental controls on, if you're not looking over their shoulders, if you're not talking to them about what can go wrong online and to come to you, these are things, there are malicious people out there that will splice pornographic and terrorist content into Peppa Pig videos.
Yes.
So yeah, these people do exist. And, from my time in industry, when we used to basically use game theory and strategize about what could go wrong and people will always find creative ways to misuse or circumvent technology. So we'll always be playing a game of whack-a-mole to a certain degree. But that's why I also believe the way we minimize the threat surface for the future is that we are developing safer, we're building protections in. We're not responding just because a revenue, regulatory, or reputational threat spurs the companies onto action. We need to be mindfully doing this. And I think this is where the rest of the world's going, where technology companies have not taken the level of responsibility they need to. And they can say they'll be forced into a corner, but who's going to cry crocodile tears for the these billion-dollar behemoths, trillion-dollar, who haven't adequately invested in safety, security, and privacy on behalf of their consumers?
So from a professional and personal point of view, Julie, I'm really interested to know what your opinion is around what Instagram were planning to do in launching Instagram for Kids, which I know they've just announced they've put it on pause. But first of all, aren't kids already using Instagram, as you just mentioned? I can't help feeling that they've slightly cynical motives here. They're just doing it because they know it's another way to gather information and monetize it. What's your view around that?
Yeah, having worked inside the industry, I know that there are a lot of good people, people that really care about safety and their customers that work inside those companies too. So I guess I'd say, the online world and social media was built by adults for adults. And we've seen that there have been a range of, there's a YouTube for kids, there's Kids Messenger, which I actually let my kids use because I think they designed it in a really safe way where I know who my kids are talking to, I approve who they're talking to, I see what they've been talking to them about. So it gives them a little bit of freedom to contact their friends, and I know who they are, and I know when that's happening and how that's happening. But yeah, I think I think the Instagram for Kids idea, if you're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe this is a way to, get them more adept at learning how social media works and preparing them for the future. Now, if you took a cynical view, you'd probably say, "Oh, they're just trying to suck them in, suck them in and have a pipeline of consumers for the future," because I don't know how a walled garden is really going to prepare you for what they're going to experience once they get on the main site. And this is what we've seen with a lot of the kids, YouTube kids, is that kids don't want just these videos. They,
No.
they want the videos that all their friends are seeing, and it's a really tricky issue. I guess the other good news is Instagram listened to critics and to stakeholders, and they put a pause on it. And I think this goes to trust. Maybe if there was a more trustworthy company that had said, we're going to do this and this is how we're going to do it, there wouldn't have been the same reaction.
That's it.
No, but do you think, I mean, I don't know whether companies like Instagram and Facebook would come to an organization like yourselves at the point that they're developing these ideas and say, hey, we're thinking of doing this. Could we have your help in making sure that we're designing it with safety built in?
They have started doing that, which is great. And that's why we started that safety by design journey as a cooperative journey, not as something that we were legislating or mandating, but as a way to say, hey, your success is our success. If your platforms are safer and we don't have to use the hard edge tools we have, then that's great. If we're lifting the safety standards overall, and I am happy to promote the innovations that you're doing. And I have to give Facebook credit. When they were developing Messenger Kids, they did reach out to us and a whole range of safety advocates who gave them advice. And they took a lot of that on board. And that's why I'm actually confident in using it, because I know they thought really mindfully about how they were going to be developing that. And I think they did listen to safety experts. But they're not going to, of course, do that with every product and service or with every refresh.
No, that's a great example, though, Julie. Thank you very much indeed for that.
I guess that's the problem, though, isn't it? I mean, my first reaction to that was quite cynical, actually. But that's just because of my kind of understanding of like big corporate and their intentions and their motives and, how they make decisions and what motivates that. But if it was and I guess that's the whole point of us moving away from that centralized system. Like it seems like people just have this hatred for like big centralized controlling organizations, and like a move towards a more peer-to-peer or decentralized model is really appealing. And I guess it's just a matter of, as business, as an audience of business here, like business owners and technologists and change makers, it's like, what kind of change or what kind of world do we want to create, especially as technology is such a fundamental part of the future. It's a really interesting time.
I think we really have to think about human nature and human behavior. You can, just as we try and fight crime, and you saw things, back in London, I don't know, back in the 17 or 1800s when they put street lamps on the street. That helped to minimize the crime because it put a spotlight on things. I mean, I think that's kind of what we're analogous to what we're trying to do with safety by design. I think we shouldn't, we need to think that human behavior is always going to be, in the picture when we're thinking about technology. And while I would love to rely upon people's best interests, and I am an optimist, I think people overall are inherently good, but it only takes a few bad apples to upset the apple cart. And what concerns me about this utopian decentralized world where there is no control, there is no responsibility, there is no accountability. What do you do when your peer-to-peer is with a cyber stalker and there is no recourse, there is no way to remediate harm, and I think it's something we need to think about.
Definitely.
peer verification.
100%.
Yeah, and we're looking at identity verification, age verification, and that's really fraught too, because if you don't get the privacy and the security right,
Yeah.
and that goes down to trust. Who do you trust? Do you trust the companies to do that? Do you trust the government to do that?
I mean, but that's the
you-
essence of it. Is like it's kind
Yep.
of not trusting anyone is kind of the nature of that design.
Yeah.
Yep. You're trusting the machines.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about how.
We've given up on
We're
humanity.
trusting how.
Yes. Brave new world. Julie, thank you
It
so
is.
much for your time today. We've had a fantastic discussion. There's so much to unpack in what you told us. We're going to put some links in the podcast notes to the Safety Commission website as well. And there's a stash of material there, I know, that's going to be very useful. Interested to know from you, is there anything in particular you'd like our listeners to go look at that will really help them understand in more detail the contribution they can make to the whole safety initiative?
Right. Sorry about the dog in the background. Safety by Design. Check it out. Have a play with the interactive tools. They're free. They've been downloaded from 30 different countries already. Look at the tech trends and challenges briefs, and we try and sort of think about what's coming ahead. Everything from deep fakes to immersive technologies, to end-to-end encryption. Tried to take a 360-degree view. Technology is always going to outpace policy, but we're trying to not let the that dog wag our tail. We're trying to wag the dog. Is that right?
I think the dog's agreeing.
Yeah.
Yeah, the dogs. I'm trying to wag the dog. Dog. I think
Julie,
our time must be up.
Yes, it is, Julie. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you again, I hope, in the not too distant future to hear how the Safety Commission is getting on. Thank you to everyone who's listened to this podcast. I know Chris is going to give us a wrap up that'll go on the end of this, but we're looking forward to hearing more about what you're doing, and good luck with everything that the Safety Commission's doing.
Thanks for all your great insights, Julie. It's lovely to meet you.
Thank you. Bye
Thanks,
for now.
Jason, Paul. Bye.
Good to see you.
Bye-bye.
Take care.